My son is terrified of his father. Today I found out the disgusting things he did to him. The screaming woke me at 2:47 in the morning, my son's voice cutting through the darkness with the kind of raw terror that makes a mother's heart stop beating. I was out of bed before I was fully conscious, running down the hallway toward Oliver's room with my pulse hammering in my throat. The screaming had stopped by the time I reached his door, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse, and when I pushed it open, I found him sitting upright in bed with his blankets twisted around his legs and his eyes fixed on the corner of the room where nothing visible stood. His pajama shirt was soaked with sweat, and his small chest heaved with panicked breathing, but when I rushed to his side and pulled him against me, his body was ice cold despite the perspiration. I asked him what was wrong, what had scared him, but Oliver just pressed his face into my shoulder and refused to speak. His whole body trembled like he was freezing, and when I tried to lay him back down, he gripped my nightgown with desperate strength and whispered, "Please don't make me sleep here anymore." I spent the rest of that night in Oliver's room, sitting in the chair beside his bed while he finally drifted into an exhausted sleep around dawn. My husband Dennis hadn't woken during the screaming, which wasn't surprising given how deeply he slept and the fact that our bedroom was on the opposite end of the house from Oliver's. I'd noticed over the past few weeks that Oliver had started looking tired, with dark circles under his eyes that seemed too pronounced for a 9-year-old, but I'd attributed it to late nights reading under his covers or playing games on the tablet we'd given him for his birthday. Now sitting in the dim light watching his small face twitch and grimace even in sleep, I realized the exhaustion went deeper than simple lack of rest. Something was genuinely frightening my son badly enough to keep him from sleeping properly, and I'd been too busy with my nursing shifts at the hospital to notice how bad things had gotten. The guilt sat heavy in my chest as I watched the sunrise paint his walls with pale orange light. Dennis was already in the kitchen making coffee when I finally came downstairs around 7, having left Oliver sleeping with his door cracked open so I could hear if he woke. My husband looked up from his phone with a distracted smile and asked if I wanted eggs, his usual morning greeting, and I told him we needed to talk about Oliver. Dennis's expression shifted into concern as he set his coffee mug down, and I explained about the nightmare and the screaming and Oliver's refusal to stay in his room. Dennis listened with his brow furrowed, then suggested maybe Oliver had watched something scary on TV or heard a frightening story at school. Kids have overactive imaginations at that age, he said reasonably, and sometimes they just need reassurance that the monsters aren't real. I wanted to believe it was that simple, but something about the terror in Oliver's eyes had felt too genuine and specific to be just imagination. I asked Dennis if he'd noticed Oliver acting differently lately, maybe seeming anxious or withdrawn, and my husband paused before admitting he hadn't spent much time with Oliver over the past month because of his new project. The basement project had started 6 weeks ago when Dennis announced he was converting the unfinished space into a proper workshop for his carpentry hobby. He'd been spending increasingly long hours down there, sometimes disappearing after dinner and not emerging until I was already in bed. I'd peek in on him occasionally and find him surrounded by sawdust and plans, building custom furniture pieces he said he was going to sell online. The basement door was usually locked when he was working. Something he explained was for safety reasons since he didn't want Oliver wandering in and getting hurt by power tools. I'd accepted this reasoning without question because Dennis had always been protective of Oliver, almost obsessively careful about potential dangers. Now as I stood in the kitchen watching my husband's face while he talked about his woodworking, I noticed how he avoided direct eye contact and how his fingers drummed against his coffee mug in a nervous rhythm I'd never seen before. When I suggested maybe Oliver could help with some of the safer workshop tasks as a way to bond, Dennis's response was sharp and immediate, saying the basement was absolutely off limits for Oliver under all circumstances. Oliver came downstairs around 9 looking pale and exhausted, moving with the careful deliberation of someone much older than his 9 years. He accepted the pancakes I made without enthusiasm, pushing them around his plate while stealing quick glances at Dennis across the table. My husband tried to engage him in conversation about school and upcoming soccer games, but Oliver's responses were monosyllabic and quiet, and I noticed how he flinched slightly every time Dennis's voice rose above a normal speaking volume. The dynamic between them felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate, like watching actors who'd forgotten their lines and were improvising badly. After breakfast, Dennis announced he had work to do in the basement and disappeared through the door at the end of the kitchen hallway, the lock clicking shut behind him with finality. Oliver watched him go with an expression I couldn't read, something between fear and resignation, and when I asked if he wanted to talk about the nightmare, he shook his head and said he couldn't remember it anymore. I had to leave for my shift at the hospital by noon, and I spent the entire drive worrying about Oliver and replaying the morning's strange interactions. The emergency department was busy enough that I couldn't dwell on my concerns until my dinner break around 7, when I finally had a moment to text Dennis and ask how Oliver was doing. The response came back quickly saying Oliver was fine, had eaten dinner, was watching TV. I typed back asking if they'd spent any time together that afternoon, and got a curt reply that Dennis had been working and Oliver knew not to interrupt. Something about the phrasing bothered me. The way it suggested Oliver had been trained not to disturb his father, rather than simply understanding basic boundaries. I tried calling to actually hear Dennis's voice and gauge his mood, but the call went to voicemail after 2 rings, which meant he'd actively declined it rather than just missing it. I left a message saying I'd be home by midnight and asking him to make sure Oliver got to bed at a reasonable hour. When I arrived home just after midnight, the house was dark except for a dim light showing under the basement door. I checked on Oliver first, finding him asleep but restless, his blankets kicked off despite the cool night air. His forehead felt clammy when I touched it, and up close I could see his eyes moving rapidly beneath his closed lids, like he was watching something frightening. I pulled his blankets back up and stood there for several minutes just watching him sleep, and I noticed details I'd missed before. His fingernails were bitten down to the quick, something Oliver had never done before. There were small bruises on his upper arms that looked like fingerprints, faint but visible once I knew to look for them. A thin scratch ran along his collarbone, mostly healed but still red enough to be recent. I felt my stomach clench as I catalogued each small injury, trying to remember if Oliver had mentioned falling or roughhousing at school, knowing I hadn't been paying close enough attention to his daily life to be certain. I found Dennis in the basement surrounded by what looked like a major construction project, far more extensive than simple workshop setup. He'd framed out multiple rooms with new walls, creating separate spaces where before there had been just one large open area. The air smelled of fresh lumber and paint, and I noticed he'd installed a new electrical panel and run conduit throughout the space. Dennis looked up from where he was kneeling beside a partially assembled cabinet, and his expression when he saw me was briefly startled, before smoothing into a smile. I commented on how much work he'd accomplished, and he said proudly that he'd been making good progress, that soon he'd have a proper studio space to work in. I asked why he needed so many separate rooms for a woodworking shop, and Dennis explained he was creating different zones for different types of projects, plus storage areas and a small office space for managing the business side. It sounded reasonable on the surface, but standing there looking at the elaborate setup, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it didn't add up. I asked Dennis about the bruises on Oliver's arms, and he looked genuinely confused, asking what bruises and suggesting Oliver probably got them playing at recess. I described the fingerprint shapes, and Dennis's confusion shifted to defensive irritation, asking if I was accusing him of something. I backed down immediately, saying of course not, just trying to understand where they came from, and Dennis's irritation faded as quickly as it had appeared. He said maybe Oliver had been grabbed during a game of tag or something. Kids play rough and don't always mention every little bump. The explanation was plausible, but delivered in a tone that discouraged further questions, and I found myself nodding and changing the subject to asking what time he'd put Oliver to bed. Dennis said around 9 that Oliver had been tired and gone up without protest, and I accepted this information while mentally noting that Oliver's behavior about bedtime had shifted significantly over the past few weeks. He used to fight tooth and nail to stay up late, but lately he'd been retreating to his room earlier and earlier, almost as if avoiding something. The next morning, Oliver refused to come downstairs for breakfast until I went up and physically coaxed him out of his room. He moved reluctantly, dragging his feet on every step, and when we reached the kitchen, he positioned himself as far from the basement door as possible while still technically being at the table. Dennis had already left for his morning run, his usual routine before disappearing into the basement for the day, and Oliver visibly relaxed once he confirmed his father wasn't home. I made scrambled eggs and toast while asking carefully neutral questions about school and friends, trying to create an opening for Oliver to tell me what was bothering him. For a while, he just picked at his food in silence, but eventually he asked in a small voice if I remembered the stories I used to tell him about angels watching over children. I said yes, remembering the phase when Oliver was 4 or 5 when those stories had comforted him before sleep. Oliver stared at his plate and said he didn't think the angels were watching anymore, or maybe they couldn't see into basements. The comment made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I asked what he meant about basements, and Oliver's eyes filled with tears that he blinked back stubbornly. He said sometimes he could hear things from down there when Dad was working, sounds that didn't make sense for woodworking. Crying sounds, he clarified when I pressed for details, like people crying for help but far away and muffled. I felt my heart rate accelerate as I asked if he'd told his father about hearing these sounds, and Oliver shook his head vigorously. Dad said he'd be very angry if Oliver ever talked about the basement to anyone, that some things were private family business and not for outsiders to know about. I assured Oliver that I wasn't an outsider. I was his mother, but he looked at me with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure that distinction mattered anymore. When I asked directly if his father had ever hurt him, Oliver's face shut down completely, and he said he didn't want to talk about it. Could he please be excused to go watch TV? I let him go while my mind raced with increasingly dark possibilities. I called in sick to my nursing shift that day, the first time I'd done so in over a year, claiming a migraine that wasn't entirely fictional given the stress headache building behind my eyes. Dennis emerged from the basement around 11 looking surprised to find me home, and I explained about the migraine and said I was going to rest in the bedroom with the curtains drawn. He accepted this with mild concern, asking if I needed anything, and I said just quiet and darkness would help. What I actually did was lie in bed with my door cracked, listening to the sounds of the house and trying to piece together what was happening. Dennis went back to the basement after making himself lunch, and I heard the lock click shut followed by the muffled sounds of power tools starting up. But underneath those normal workshop noises, if I listened very carefully, I could hear something else. Voices maybe, or crying, exactly as Oliver had described. The sounds were so faint I couldn't be completely certain they weren't just pipes or the HVAC system, but once I'd heard them, I couldn't unhear them. I waited until I was certain Dennis was absorbed in his work before creeping down the hallway to Oliver's room. My son was lying on his bed staring at the ceiling, and he didn't seem surprised when I came in and closed the door quietly behind me. I sat on the edge of his bed and told him I needed him to be completely honest with me about what was happening, that nothing he said would get him in trouble with me. Oliver looked at me for a long moment before sitting up and pulling his shirt over his head, revealing more bruises across his back and ribs, some fresh and some fading to yellow-green. The sight made me gasp involuntarily, and Oliver quickly put his shirt back on while explaining in a flat voice that Dad said he needed to learn discipline. These were teaching marks, he said in a tone that suggested he was repeating something he'd been told many times, reminders to follow rules and not ask questions. I asked what rules he'd broken, and Oliver said too many to list, but mostly rules about the basement and what he was supposed to not notice or remember. I held my son while he finally broke down and cried, his small body shaking against mine with sobs he'd clearly been holding in for a long time. Between gasps, he told me about being woken in the middle of the night sometimes, taken down to the basement to help Dad with projects. Special projects, Oliver called them, that involved the rooms Dad had built behind the false walls. Oliver described carrying things down there, heavy things in bags that Dad said were supplies for his workshop, but the bags had smelled wrong and sometimes leaked. He'd been told to dig in one of the back rooms to make the floor deeper, and while he dug, Dad had worked on something in another room, something that made wet sounds and occasional thumping noises Oliver couldn't identify. I felt cold spreading through my body as Oliver described seeing things he wasn't supposed to see when Dad forgot to close doors all the way, glimpses of spaces that didn't look like workshop areas at all but more like something else, something worse. I asked Oliver why he hadn't told me any of this before, and he said Dad had explained very carefully that if Oliver told anyone, especially me, that Dad would have to make sure Oliver couldn't tell anyone anything ever again. The threat had been delivered calmly and matter-of-factly, not in anger but as simple statement of consequences, which somehow made it more terrifying than if Dennis had been raging. Oliver said he'd been too scared to risk finding out what that meant, but the nightmares had gotten so bad that he couldn't keep pretending everything was normal anymore. Last night's screaming had been because of a dream where the people he'd heard crying in the basement had found him in his room, their faces like shadows and their hands reaching for him, asking why he hadn't helped them. I held my son and promised him that I would fix this, that he wouldn't have to go back down to the basement ever again, and I saw relief and terror war across his face as he absorbed my words. I needed proof before I could act on Oliver's accusations. As horrible as his description was, I knew that going to police with just a child's nightmares and vague reports of scary sounds wouldn't be enough, especially against a father with no criminal record and a community reputation as a devoted family man. I waited until Dennis's usual afternoon workout time, when he'd shower and get ready for an evening run, and I told Oliver to stay in his room with his door locked no matter what he heard. My son nodded with wide, frightened eyes, and I heard his lock click into place as I made my way back down to the basement door. Dennis kept the key on a magnetic strip under the kitchen sink, presumably so he could access it without needing to carry it constantly, and I retrieved it with shaking hands. The key turned smoothly in the lock and I opened the door to the basement stairs, pausing at the top to listen for any indication Dennis had heard me. The house stayed quiet except for the shower running upstairs. The basement was dim despite the work lights Dennis had strung throughout the space, shadows pooling in corners and making the new walls look less substantial than they probably were. I moved carefully through the main workshop area, noting the legitimate tools and lumber and partially completed furniture pieces that suggested normal hobby activity. But beyond the workshop section, through a narrow doorway I hadn't noticed from my previous visit, was where things became distinctly wrong. The back rooms Oliver had mentioned were accessible only through what looked like a false wall panel that swung inward when I pushed on it, revealing a corridor lined with several doors. The first door opened into a small empty room with a drain in the center of the concrete floor and dark stains that made my stomach turn. The second room contained what looked like restraints bolted to the walls and ceiling, along with various implements I didn't want to examine too closely. The third door was locked with a padlock I couldn't open without tools. I stood in that narrow corridor feeling like I might vomit, pulling out my phone to take photographs of everything while my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the device steady. The evidence in just these two rooms was enough to prove Dennis had been doing something deeply wrong, though I still didn't know the full extent of what Oliver had been witnessing. I heard the shower shut off upstairs and panic shot through me as I realized I'd lost track of time. I backed out of the corridor and pulled the false wall panel closed, retreating through the basement as quietly as possible while terror made my movements clumsy. I'd just reached the stairs when I heard footsteps on the floor above, Dennis moving around in the bedroom directly overhead. I climbed the stairs two at a time and locked the basement door behind me, returning the key to its hiding spot seconds before Dennis appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing his running clothes and looking surprised to see me up and moving around given my supposed migraine. I manufactured a smile and said I was feeling better, maybe just needed some food in my system, and I busied myself making a sandwich while Dennis watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He asked if I'd been sleeping, and I confirmed yes, Most of the afternoon, the lie rolling off my tongue with surprising ease. Dennis nodded slowly and said, "That was good, that I'd been working too hard lately and needed rest." Then he mentioned casually that he'd been thinking about taking Oliver camping this weekend, just the two of them, a father-son bonding trip to do some fishing and hiking. My blood ran cold at the thought of my son being alone in the wilderness with Dennis, away from witnesses and help, especially now that I knew what Oliver had been subjected to in the basement. I said quickly that Oliver had mentioned a school project due Monday and probably shouldn't miss the weekend to work on it, and I saw something flicker across Dennis's face, annoyance or maybe suspicion, before he accepted this with forced casualness. He left for his run moments later, and I immediately went to Oliver's room, unlocking it with my emergency key when he didn't respond to my knock. Oliver was curled up in his closet with his knees pulled to his chest, and he looked up at me with such relief when I assured him I was alone that it broke my heart. I told him I'd seen the basement rooms and I believed everything he'd told me, and now we were going to leave and go somewhere safe while I figured out what to do next. Oliver asked in a tiny voice if Dad would find us, and I said not if we were careful and smart about how we left. I instructed Oliver to pack a backpack with clothes and anything important he wanted to bring, making it look normal like he was just organizing his things, rather than obviously preparing to run. I did the same in my own bedroom, gathering essentials and hiding them in places Dennis wouldn't notice if he glanced in. I also copied all the photos from my phone to a cloud backup and emailed them to my personal account, with a detailed note about when and where they were taken. If something happened to me or my phone, at least there would be a record somewhere. Dennis returned from his run 45 minutes later, looking flushed and energized, and he announced he was going to spend the evening working on a special project in the basement. He said he'd probably be down there late and not to wait up for him, kissing my forehead in a gesture that used to feel affectionate, but now made my skin crawl. I forced myself to smile and said I'd probably turn in early anyway since I was still feeling off from the migraine. Oliver had already eaten dinner in his room, claiming homework, and Dennis seemed satisfied with these explanations. He disappeared into the basement around 7, and I heard the lock click shut, then waited in our bedroom with my packed bag and Oliver's hidden beside it. At midnight, when I was certain Dennis was deeply absorbed in whatever he was doing down there, I went to Oliver's room and told him it was time to go. We crept through the house like burglars, grabbing our bags from my bedroom and slipping out the side door to where my car was parked in the driveway. The drive to my sister Audrey's house took 90 minutes, and I spent the entire time watching my mirrors for signs of Dennis following us, even though I knew rationally he couldn't know we'd left yet. Oliver sat beside me in silence, occasionally asking if I was sure this was okay, if we were really safe now, and I gave him reassurances I wasn't certain I believed. Audrey answered her door in pajamas, looking confused, and her confusion shifted to alarm when she saw our expressions and the bags we carried. I told her I needed somewhere to stay for a few days, and I'd explain everything once Oliver was settled, and my sister nodded without questioning further. She set Oliver up in her guest room with extra blankets and the promise of pancakes in the morning, and once my son was finally asleep, Audrey and I sat at her kitchen table while I showed her the photographs from the basement and explained everything Oliver had told me. My sister's face went pale and then red with fury, and she said we needed to call the police immediately, tonight, before Dennis discovered we were gone. We called 911 from Audrey's landline, and I explained to the dispatcher that I'd discovered evidence of possible crimes in my basement, and my son had been abused, and could they please send officers to investigate. The dispatcher asked if anyone was in immediate danger, and I said no, we'd left the house, but I needed someone to secure the scene before my husband could destroy evidence. She said she'd send officers to Audrey's address to take my statement and also dispatch units to my home. While we waited for the police to arrive, I called my attorney from work, the one who'd handled my grandmother's estate, and who I'd always found competent and trustworthy. I woke him at 2 in the morning and explained that I needed immediate help with what was potentially becoming a criminal case, and he agreed to meet me at the police station once I'd given my initial statement. He warned me that once I opened this door there would be no closing it, that I was starting a process that would expose my entire family to scrutiny, and probably destroy my marriage. And I told him my marriage was already destroyed, I just hadn't known it until yesterday. The police arrived at Audrey's house within 20 minutes. 2 officers who took my statement with increasing seriousness as I showed them the photographs and explained Oliver's disclosures. They called for detectives and more units, and suddenly Audrey's quiet suburban home was full of law enforcement activity. Detective Reeves was the lead investigator, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, and she sat with me for over an hour going through every detail I could remember. She said they were executing a search warrant on my home as we spoke, that Dennis had been detained at the scene, and that they'd need to interview Oliver once Child Protective Services arrived to ensure proper protocol. I asked what they'd found at the house, and Detective Reeves said she couldn't share operational details yet, but her expression told me it was bad. She mentioned they'd discovered the hidden rooms I'd photographed, plus additional spaces I hadn't found, and they'd called in crime scene technicians and cadaver dogs. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of interviews and statements and medical examinations for Oliver that revealed more bruises and evidence of repeated physical abuse. Child Protective Services cleared me of involvement after extensive investigation, acknowledging I'd been working night shifts and had no knowledge of Dennis's activities until Oliver's disclosures prompted my basement investigation. Dennis was arrested and charged with multiple counts I couldn't follow, legal terminology that boiled down to him having done unspeakable things in those hidden basement rooms. Oliver stayed with Audrey and me while investigators pieced together the full extent of Dennis's crimes, and slowly a horrifying picture emerged. The sounds Oliver had heard weren't his imagination or the house settling. Dennis had been keeping people in those rooms, homeless individuals he'd lured home with promises of work or food, and what he'd done to them before they disappeared was documented in videos the forensic team found hidden in encrypted files on his computer. The trial took place 8 months later and lasted 3 weeks of testimony that made national news. Dennis's defense attorney tried to paint him as mentally ill, suffering from dissociative episodes where he didn't remember his actions, but the extensive planning and sophisticated concealment proved consciousness and intent. Prosecutors presented evidence of at least 7 victims over a 2-year period, people whose disappearances had been written off as homeless transients moving on to other cities. They'd found remains buried in that deep hole Oliver had been forced to help dig, and DNA evidence tied those remains to missing persons cases across 3 states. Oliver testified via closed-circuit video about what he'd been made to witness and participate in, his small voice describing carrying bags and digging dirt and hearing sounds he couldn't explain. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on every count. Dennis was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, and when the judge asked if he had anything to say, Dennis looked directly at the camera he knew Oliver was watching through and said he was sorry, that he'd never meant for his son to see those things. Oliver and I started over in a new state with new names through a victim protection program that helped us disappear from the media attention that persisted even after Dennis's sentencing. My son spent years in therapy processing what he'd witnessed and been forced to participate in under threat of violence. The nightmares gradually became less frequent but never fully stopped. On difficult nights, I'd hear him wake screaming, and I'd go to his room to find him sitting upright and terrified, and I'd hold him while he cried about shadows and basements and sounds he couldn't unhear. His therapist said he'd carry that trauma his entire life, that what Dennis had subjected him to had altered his development in ways we were still discovering. Oliver grew into a teenager who was simultaneously too old for his years and frozen at age 9, the point when his childhood ended and survival began. Years later, when Oliver was 17 and preparing for college, he asked me why I'd believed him when he finally told me what was happening. He said some of his therapy group members had tried telling their parents about abuse and been dismissed or punished for lying, and he'd always wondered what made me different, what made me listen. I told him the truth, which was that I'd almost not believed him, that the truth he was telling was so horrible that my mind wanted to reject it as impossible. But I'd seen the fear in his eyes, and the bruises on his skin, and some part of me had recognized that children don't fake that kind of terror. I'd chosen to investigate rather than dismiss, to believe rather than rationalize, and that choice had saved his life even if it came too late to save him from trauma. Oliver nodded slowly and said he wished I'd noticed sooner. Wish I'd seen the signs before he had to carry bags down those stairs and dig holes in the dark. I told him I wished that too, that I'd carry that guilt forever, but at least I'd ultimately made the right choice even if it was later than it should have been. We both survived, I said, and that had to be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.